Call Me Francis Tucket. Here we are at chapter 5. It was a wonderful dream. He had dreamt many times since Braid had taken him from the wagon train and he had trapped with Jason Grimes, most often of his parents. Some of them were nightmares, some were happy, but this one was best of all. He dreamt about beans. His mother had a large pot of beans on the stove, and she had put a ham hock in them so the fat and taste went into the beans, and it had cooked to perfection. And his mother had ladled some into a bowl and put a chunk of butter on top and was handing it to him, just handing it to him, and his eyes opened. He had no real way to tell time, but there was a sliver of a moon, and it had risen to halfway across the sky. He guessed that half the night was gone, and if they were going to sleep, they would be by now. If they were going to sleep, they would be by now. Francis had been sitting on a rock, dozing, and he rose, stretched, rubbed his arms, and set off in the dark. The day's run had worn a hole in his right moccasin, and it kept scooping dirt, which he shook out periodically. When he stopped to shake his moccasin the third time, he turned and saw that the mule was with him. It is one thing to sneak into a camp and try to steal my stuff back alone, he thought, looking at the mule. It is something else again to do it with a whole mule walking in back of me. There was a very real danger. If the mare smelled the mule, she might whicker or whinny, and the sound would awaken the two men, if they were asleep, if he could get close enough. If. He couldn't stop the mule if it wanted to follow him, and he finally decided to chance it. He would need luck but the way it was going, he would need all the luck in the world anyway. He might as well push it. He turned and trotted off again, sensed rather than heard the mule following him, clumping along. Things looked dramatically different in the dark. Twice he saw coyotes, once a single wolf that moved off into the darkness, and several times he passed buffalo. A rattlesnake buzzed as he passed, but it was well away from his path and stopped as soon as he was by. The stream bed didn't show at all at first, and then when he thought he would never get to it, he was suddenly in the trees and low brush that grew along the watercourse. He stopped, listening, but could hear only the sound of the mule eating in back of him. The mule ate every time he stopped. He had been eating all day, every chance it got, but the sound wasn't loud, and after a moment he moved on. There was no fire to see now, which was a good sign, and he hoped it meant both men were asleep. But it made things difficult as far as finding the camp. He didn't want to blunder into them, but he was running out of time. It would begin to get light soon, within the hour, and they would awaken. His nose finally did the trick. As he turned, looking for some glow of embers and trying to see the mare in the dark, he smelled the smoke from the nearly dead fire. To the left, it was stronger, and he moved that way, and hadn't gone 20 yards when he found them. It was hard to see in the dark, but he made out the shape of the mare across the fire. She either did not see the mule or didn't care, and was silent. The men were harder to locate. He stood for a full 3 minutes studying the campsite, finally saw them against the dark brush around the fire clearing. Dubs was to his left, lying on his side, with no blanket over him, sleeping like a great bear, and Cortweiler was across the fire pit on his back with Francis's saddle for a pillow and Francis's blanket and bedroll for covers. They were both snoring, but so lowly that Francis had to concentrate to hear it, and he smiled. Good, they were asleep. Now, if he could locate his rifle. None of this would work without the rifle. Actually, both rifles. He needed his and Dub's. 2 men, 2 shots. He had no real plan except to get his rifle and force them to give his equipment back. There, his Lancaster rifle was next to Cortweiler, the muzzle across the saddle by his head. Close, maybe too close. How would it go? He tried to imagine it, plan it. He would get his rifle and then cover them and somehow get Dub's rifle. And what, shoot them if they made a try for him? Shoot them? He hesitated. He'd never shot a person, or at least he didn't think he had. He had aimed at an Indian who was attacking him, but he thought Jason Grimes had done the shooting, and he'd missed, or maybe wounded him. On the other hand, they had left him for dead, these 2 men. They could easily kill him, and would if they got a chance. That's how it might play. He'd get his rifle, try to get Dub's weapon, and shoot the big man if he had to. He took a breath, held it, worked his way softly and quietly around the side of the fire until he was standing over Cortweiler. He squatted, reached forward, and gently, so gently, wrapped his fingers around the stock of the rifle just ahead of the hammer and lifted it away from the saddle, stood back with it. I missed you, he thought, holding the little Lancaster. He felt to make sure there was a cap on the nipple, then eared the hammer back slowly, holding the trigger so it wouldn't make a clicking sound when it cocked. So far, so good. He stood back and away and moved around to Dubs. The giant's rifle was next to him on the ground, and Francis leaned down carefully and reached for it and happened to look at Dub's face and nearly screamed out loud. Dub's eyes were wide open, staring at him. Even in the pale light from the partial moon, Francis could see the whites, the glare from them, and he thought, I'm dead. This instant I'm dead. But Dubs didn't move, and when he peered closer, something it took his whole heart to do. He saw that the eyes weren't truly on him. They were just open. Dubs slept with his eyes open. It was enough to stop Francis. He stared at the man, moved his hands back and forth in front of his eyes, and there was no reaction. Nothing. But the delay was nearly fatal. He had a firm grip on Dub's rifle, was lifting it away when he heard a small sound in back of him, a rustling, and something grabbed his hair. Ah, it's you, Francis. How good of you to call. Francis tore free, but the sound had awakened Dubs, and both men came at him. He somehow didn't remember he was holding two rifles and could shoot them, and in any event, it was all happening too fast. Dubs came up out of sleep instantly, animistically, ready for battle. He rolled to his feet, towered over Francis, reached for him from the left, while Kortweiler reached from the right. They would have him. In a second or less, they would have him. He fell backward over the dead fire, and his fall saved him. Dubs was nearly on top of him, but overshot when he reached for Francis. The hulk went over Francis a good 2 feet beyond and ran squarely into the mule who had been following Francis as before. There was a sound like someone splitting a watermelon with an axe, and Dubs dropped as if he'd been shot with a howitzer. The mule swung a bit to the side, aimed quickly, and caught Kortweiler dead in the middle of the stomach with another well-aimed kick, and Kortweiler went down, wheezing for breath. Suddenly, Francis was the only human able to function. He stood quickly, aimed the rifle at the two men, but it wasn't necessary. Dubs had taken it directly to the head, and while he was still breathing, it would clearly be some time before he regained consciousness. Kortweiler still couldn't breathe and was only half conscious himself. I guess you must have been hard on the mule, Francis said aloud as he gathered his gear. I hear they've got good memories. He moved from the fire pit to the mare, caught her, and led her back to the camp to saddle, watching the two men all the while, the Lancaster still cocked and ready to fire. In the east, there was a gray softness to the dark, and he worked quite quickly. He wanted to be well away from these two before they could react, and he tied his bedroll in place in back of the saddle and laid his shirt across his lap as he mounted. He didn't want to lower his guard long enough to pull the shirt on over his head. He had taken what equipment there was that belonged to the two men as well, and he draped it across the mare's neck. You're leaving us like this? Kortweiler gasped while he spoke, still fighting for breath. Francis nodded. You're lucky I didn't put a ball in you. He used his leg to back the mare away from the camp. Before turning he said softly, Don't come at me again. I won't be so easy to catch off guard, and I will shoot you. Kortweiler said nothing, and Francis turned and rode away, smiling to himself when he saw the mule take one last bite of bunch grass and rush to follow him. When he was half a mile from the man, he stopped and pulled his shirt on, lashed the extra rifle, which turned out to be a crude version of a Hawkins with what appeared to be a half-inch bore, to the saddle horn so it hung down the mare's side, and tied his canteen and the one he'd taken from Kortweiler so they balanced one on either side. Then he set off again, and the sun coming over his back. He needed miles in case they decided to follow him, as he had done with them, so he heeled the mare and picked up the speed, the mule shambling along and back. He caught himself humming in time to the mare's movement and smiled openly. Where he'd been alone, he now had two friends. One of them, the mule, a definitely powerful friend. Where he'd been without anything, he now had two canteens, two rifles, two possibles bags, and an extra horn almost full of power. He was rich. Now all he had to do was find the wagon train and get out to Oregon. Bye.